As Richard said, I'm with the Canadian Freshwater Alliance, and I'm the Communications and Special Projects Coordinator with the Alliance. And for those of you who are familiar with us, we are a nonprofit initiative that basically works to build capacity of local groups who are working to protect their freshwater where they live. And we also do a few campaigns on policy topics across the country. So today I've been very interested to hear the different perspectives on the much needed and important topic of restorative development and watershed sustainability. And certainly this is a task that many in different sectors really need to get behind. So, we need the stewardship community, academia, different levels of government. And while it's certainly true that we need many on board, I think it's also true that some people have more of an ability to affect that change than others. And I know a number of you are here with local government today, and I think that local governments are very uniquely positioned to do this kind of work. They have power related to environmental protection and land use change within their jurisdictions. They have mandates, again, related to development and land use change. And they're the level of government that is the closest to the issues and also to the solutions. Many of them live where they work. And I also think that among, in particular, staff who are on the front line doing this work, there's a great deal of interest in sustainable watershed management. So today I'm gonna kind of flip what we've heard today and look at the other angle. We've heard a lot about the great work that's happening, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges, and in particular how the province might be able to play a role in addressing some of those challenges and gaps. So the presentation that I'm going to give is based on research that I conducted last year that involves several dozen watershed practitioners working with or for local government. And basically, I was working with those practitioners to do research, to hear their opinions, to find out what they thought was working and what wasn't working, and compile those findings into a summary report, which is available on our website, and I'll share that link at the end of my presentation. And so the impetus of that research was based on continuing work from the nonprofit Evergreen, which is based in Vancouver in the Lower Mainland, and they've been doing work on urban watershed sustainability with local governments and the stewardship community. And something that they found in that work is that local governments really wanted to know what BC's new water legislation, the Water Sustainability Act, would mean for them. So they applied for funding from the Bullet Foundation, the Real Estate Foundation of BC, and then contracted us to look into that. So even though we have this bright, new, shiny legislation that was called into force in February of 2016, the Water Sustainability Act is what is called enabling legislation. So it sets out a lot of powers in different areas that the province can regulate, but a lot of the details and the teeth of how it will actually play out and be implemented on the ground really depends on regulation and different policy and funding levers. So with this research, we were really interested in building an empirical case for how, under that act, tools could be developed that really support local governments in their ability and in their capacity to sustainably manage watersheds that fall within their jurisdiction. And as I mentioned, we honed in on urban watersheds, which have pretty specific challenges, but that aren't explicitly acknowledged in the legislation. But so in order to know what those tools could be, we first needed to find out what are the environmental challenges that local government practitioners are seeing in their watersheds, and why are they challenged to address them? So in other words, what are the management challenges? And then from there, we were able to look at the legislation and the kinds of powers that it assigns and develop some recommendations. So I mentioned the research with local government practitioners. So there were a few different ways that we gathered that research. There was a survey that was sent out to 79 folks in urban areas across BC. We got 35 responses. We also did some deep dive interviews to follow up on those survey responses with 5 practitioners and also 3 experts that aren't necessarily practitioners themselves, but are looking at the policy level or the broader picture. A literature review. We also had an advisory panel of 5 different people with different experience in water policy and watershed management. And then once I compiled all of the findings from that initial research, I held a webinar to kind of triangulate and corroborate what I found with the people that I interviewed and who did the survey. So 12 people were on that webinar. And then I took what I heard and compiled it into a final report, which then was reviewed by external reviewers. And then finally, we took the recommendations to a workshop where about 50 watershed practitioners and people from the stewardship community, First Nations, participated, and we workshopped those recommendations and put it in a final report. So very quickly, I'll just say what I meant by urban and watershed sustainability in this context. So urban, the definition that we used is at least 300 people per square kilometer. So the BC average is 4 people per square kilometer. Obviously, that's spread out through a very large area. And looking specifically at places with populations of 10,000 people or more. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the recommendations won't also be relevant to places with less density or with lower populations, but that was who we focused on. And in particular, we looked at municipalities and regional districts. So in the Metro Vancouver area, Eastern Vancouver Island, the Kamloops area, and the Okanagan. And then watershed sustainability, I mean, it doesn't lend itself so readily to a very operational definition, but based on what Bob brought up last night of the Brundtland report, the idea that environmental resources and ecosystems are conditioned such that the needs of both current and future generations can be met, and consequently that ecological and hydrological integrity is able to provide water in qualities and quantities that allow those needs to be met. So basically, we left how that was interpreted up to the practitioners who participated in the research. So I'm not going to get too much into some of the issues that we see in urban watersheds. We already talked about a lot of that today, and I know many of you are already quite familiar with this. So this was basically, it was based on the literature review. One very interesting statistic that I will say that I came across is it takes a very little amount of land use change to see pretty big impacts in the watershed. And one review in particular said that after about 5 to 15% of land use change in the watershed, there's significant declines in salmonid populations. And of course, all of these issues are then magnified by climate change. So I'll just get right into the survey responses. So the survey contained a variety of questions gauging opinion on the severity of environmental issues, perceived causes and barriers to addressing them. As I said, the respondents were from the Lower Mainland, so separated out Lower Mainland respondents from those living in more highly urbanized areas. Identified that as places with a density of 600 people per square kilometer or more, or moderately urbanized areas. Eastern Vancouver Island, we only had a couple, Kamloops and the Okanagan. And most of the respondents were with a municipality or a regional district, but we also had a few folks from collaborative partnerships or agencies, consulting firms that work with local governments, First Nation band or organization, municipality. And I'll just clarify that when I say local government in the context of this research, I'm really talking about municipalities and regional governments. First Nations, of course, do a lot of work that is very relevant at the local level and applies to the local level, but because they are nations, they have different realms of responsibilities and roles with regard to local government. So very different context. So I was looking specifically at regional districts and municipalities. So in response to the question, please rate the severity of the following environmental issues in your watersheds out of 5. These are the responses that we got. So as you can see, especially towards the left, there's much more red and orange than there is green and yellow. So they were asked to rate it out of 5, 5 being the most severe and 1 being not really a problem. And so by far the top 2 were riparian habitat loss. So 80% of people thought it was either a very big issue or a big issue, and droughts and or low stream flows. And then followed not too far behind by flooding. There was variation by region, which for the sake of time, I'm not going to get into too much here, but if you're interested, you can look at that in the report. A big one was drinking water quality was rated as very different issues in different places, and I think in particular the Lower Mainland, because they have protected watersheds, and in the interior they do not. So I think there was the most variation in responses with regard to that. So then we wanted to look at what are the underlying causes. So what are the pressures that are giving rise to these environmental challenges in the first place? So again, the question, please rate the severity of the following watershed threats or stressors in the urban centers where you operate. And here we see land use change as being rated the most salient pressure. Followed by impervious surfaces, which is of course related to land use change, but not necessarily a change. It might have been there from before. And climate change as being number 3. So we had 84% of respondents saying that land use change was either a very significant issue or a significant issue in their watershed. And again, some variation by region that I won't get into too much here. So, I mean, local government, we've been hearing about this all day. Local governments, of course, they have tools at their disposal to address some of these environmental issues, and a lot of local governments are doing really fantastic work in this regard. I'll just quickly go over some of the tools that do exist. So, of course, there's bylaws. We've talked about development permit areas today, zoning regulations. We talked about well, I don't know if we actually talked about water demand management programs today, but of course that's a tool for local governments that are also purveyors. We talked about funding mechanisms, so the Regional District of Nanaimo has recently instituted their land parcel tax. There are a few other local governments that have also done some innovative funding structures as well. Something that is interesting to note, though, in this research, so there are federal and provincial grants available for infrastructure and for including green infrastructure. But despite the grants that do exist, over the years, more and more of the share of funding infrastructure has fallen to local governments. So in 1950, local governments contributed on average 27% to infrastructure investments. And by 2010, they were paying over 48%. So more and more of that onus is falling on local governments to fund that themselves. So starting to look now at what those management barriers are. So the question, can local governments adequately address watershed issues? The majority of respondents said some of them. Some of them said no, 18% said no, and the rest of people said either yes, or most of them, or unsure. Something that was interesting to note is I did a follow-up interview with someone who said, yes, we can adequately address watershed issues. And I asked him for clarification and why he thought that was, and he said, well, local government does, in theory, have the tools necessary, but those tools aren't necessarily always deployed or used. So in terms of barriers, again, the question, rate 1 to 5. What do you think are the biggest barriers to addressing watershed issues at the local level? Okay, so you can't really see it in the graph here, but funding was rated, not surprisingly, number 1. Support from higher levels of government was rated as the second most salient barrier. And policies and standards that support local government wasn't rated number 3. Interestingly, the least salient barrier was insufficient data and management. There was a few people, insufficient data and information. So there were a few people that said, we have the data, we know what we need to do, but it's not being done. So on the survey as well, there was also a comments section, and in the interviews, those were 45 minutes to an hour or so, and we were able to take that information, that qualitative information, in addition with the survey responses, and identify some kind of key themes or challenges that are hampering local government's ability to sustainably manage their watersheds. So first of all, this was brought up a few times in different ways, and it's basically the tension that voluntary protections don't always lead to outcomes. BC really has a very enabling approach to local government. The Local Government Act and the Community Charter, it gives local governments all of these powers to regulate, but there's not very much legislation that necessarily requires action to be taken. Of course, there are some exceptions like the riparian areas regulation or the sewerage regulations as well. But there was, I mean, the good is, of course, that it gives flexibility, and the not so good is that protections can be very uneven, and a lot is left up to the political will of the local organization or the local government. And so the idea of political will was brought up by a few different participants, and in particular, one interview we talked about how even if there is a requirement for something, like a plan, for example, if there aren't necessarily requirements for outcomes, then that plan might not necessarily be acted upon. So, you know, their quote there, "It's a plan, it doesn't mean it's a have to." I'm not going to talk about the solutions in depth here, just in the interest of time, but for every of the barriers identified, we also identified some of the solutions, and those solutions are also encompassed in the recommendations. So, number 2 was the idea of long-term planning versus short-term political cycles. I mean, this is not specific to watershed management in BC. It's kind of an existential question of environmental management everywhere. But you know, it basically the idea is encompassed in that local governments are responsive to their constituents. They're under pressure to show value for money, and the beneficial impacts of a restoration project, they might not reveal themselves for, you know, as little as a few months to as many as, you know, decades, if not more. And local governments are under pressure to show their constituencies how that those public funds are benefiting the community on a much shorter term or risk losing elections. So there were a few folks that I talked to that showed some frustration that, you know, budgets or public agendas are maybe determined by what's politically palatable and not necessarily what's in the best interest of the community. A piecemeal approach. So the idea that many of the tools are very site-specific and that they pertain to future developments, but not necessarily looking at the damage that's already been done or the degradation that's already happened. So here's a quote. Someone says that the current suite of tools are slowing down the loss, but it's very hard to move the needle forward. So this is really that restorative development issue that we've been talking about. So the tools are able to, you know, for future developments require certain things, but not necessarily looking at the past. And I thought that, you know, in particular that could maybe explain, despite things like such as the riparian areas regulations that are in effect, that local watershed practitioners are pretty concerned about the welfare of riparian areas, particularly in highly urbanized watersheds, because they've already been built out. And those regulations are looking at new developments. Not surprisingly, a lack of resources to support on-the-ground work. I mean, this was identified as the largest barrier in the survey. Someone said huge watersheds, so many stakeholders, no time, no funds. And interestingly, this pertained as much to local government as it did to provincial government. So there was quite a few people who mentioned that the provincial government themselves don't have the staff and the resources to adequately be able to fulfill their own duties, and sometimes that was a real source of frustration for local governments who were trying to, for example, you know, work in collaboration with the provincial government or get a permit that they needed in order to do a green infrastructure project and was not hearing back, and or, you know, that the crown lands or upper watersheds are not being managed or enforced the way that they ought to be. And someone said here, I applaud the recent changes to the Act, but I feel that the province will be hard-pressed to respond to the new work that it will generate. And kind of drawing on this underfunding, understaffing issue, was the idea of accountability of provincial and federal governments. So it was brought up to with regard to both level of governments, but more specifically came up with regard to the province, which I mean makes sense because that is the province's mandate is watershed management. It was brought up unprompted, both in the survey and in the interviews. And again, local governments that I spoke with or that did the survey expressed frustration that it undermined their efforts to be able to protect and restore their watersheds. That the province wasn't necessarily enforcing existing water licenses or legal withdrawals. That the province was acting in a very reactive manner and not necessarily getting ahead of the issues. Number 6 was so this kind of uncollaborative decision making, as we already talked about a few times today. Watershed boundaries cross jurisdictional boundaries, and so sustainable watershed management requires partnerships and coordination between a lot of different levels of government and ample resources to be able to carry that forward. So there's concerns that local governments are constrained in some things and they can't do everything because not everything is within their jurisdiction to be able to do. But a few participants talked about how provincial and even federal participation in local watershed management was lacking and sometimes almost non-existent at the local level. There are a few folks that I spoke with that said that the province used to come to the table and stop showing up. And when I held the forum in October, we did have provincial representatives there, and they also spoke to their frustration and that staffing had been cut, and so one person that used to be able to do that didn't have time anymore because they had more responsibilities as well. Another thing is that there's quite a bit of unevenness around BC with regard to what kind of collaborative watershed decision-making mechanisms exist. So, in some watersheds, there are actually formalized entities that have some kind of legal status, like the Okanagan Basin Water Board, for example. And in others, there's more ad hoc partnerships that come together, and in others still there aren't those partnerships, but maybe there might be an intergovernmental committee or what have you. And then finally, the last theme was that it's a fragmented and kind of complex framework in BC. I think the issue of conflicting mandates came up earlier today with regard to engineering standards, and so someone said, conflicting mandates to add source controls, it kind of comes into conflict with the BC Building Code. There's a lot of different acts and legislation that are regulating different things, and there's a lot of things that already exist. So there was a desire to make sure that the New Water Sustainability Act really is a vehicle or a mechanism to be able to foster that coordination, and that it doesn't kind of recreate the wheel. So there's already things that exist, such as water sustainability plans or water assessment and response plans, and so really the desire that if there's a new plan, it's not something entirely different, but that it coincides with all of these other different tools, and that it is able to bring those tools together. So I'll just kind of jump through the leverage points of the Water Sustainability Act. I'm sure there's a lot of different levels of familiarity and knowledge about the Act in the room and kind of the powers that it does enable and lie out. But I'll just get right into the recommendation. So we identified 5 key areas of opportunity for regulatory and policy development, so not necessarily just regulation, but also looking at funding levers and policy levers and that as well. So those recommendations, they build upon the solutions for each of the barriers that I just discussed. And so there's 14 recommendations in total, and then there's sub-recommendations for each area. So the first area for recommendations is connecting land and water with water objectives. So the Water Sustainability Act has sets out a tool called water objectives, which can basically enable regulation around pertaining to water quality, water quantity, or ecosystem health. And so how those water objectives will play out or what they're going to look like, that has yet to be determined. But there was definitely a lot of enthusiasm for water objectives as a tool, but people that were involved in the research, they really wanted to see them. They really wanted them to see them be performance-based and have a lot of flexibility for local context. To involve local governments and First Nations, to give legal precedence despite other enactments, to allow them to apply also to urbanized watersheds, and also that there is mechanisms in place to monitor and review water objectives, so that we know that they're being effective, that they're not just another regulation that's out there, but they're actually serving and doing what they're supposed to do. So the second area was improving coordination and transparency in watershed decision making. So this includes things like developing guidance and processes for local government on how the watershed decision making will be affected by the Water Sustainability Act. Developing water governance pilots in priority areas, which could form the basis for watershed entities, so these watershed governance mechanisms. And actually, since I've written this, the government has announced recently a watershed governance pilot in the Nicola region with the Nicola First Nation. So it'll be really interesting to see what comes out of that. Things like establishing a third-party capacity building entity to coordinate and facilitate knowledge transfer between watershed entities and different levels of government. And when water sustainability plans are designated, ensure plans consider and incorporate the efforts of previous watershed planning efforts, local government community plans and bylaws, so that they're really intersecting with the work that's already been done and, again, not recreating the wheel. Securing adequate funds for watershed management. So a big one here is looking at the current rate structure and the fees set out in the water sustainability fees, charges, and rentals regulations, and seeing if that if the revenue raised through that is enough to adequately implement the act and the extra work that it gives rise to. And another opportunity here is working with a sustainable funding task force to explore and test implementation of other sustainable funding mechanisms for watershed management. Ensuring water is protected for nature, so looking at establishing legally enforceable regulations to protect environmental flows, and also the possibility of developing an environmental flows task force with the participation of local government, First Nations, and the federal government. So monitoring and reporting on watershed health. So require all water users to monitor water withdrawals and report their use to government. And then compile a summary of water data into a State of Our Waters report that's publicly accessible and issued on a regular basis, so we're suggesting every 5 years. And the government did commit back in 2008 to doing a State of Our Waters report that would include all of that information, and unfortunately we haven't seen that yet, so this is a gentle reminder that this might be a great thing for people working in the stewardship sector and local government to be able to see that data and that big picture. And of course, looking at identifying opportunities to coordinate and streamline water data from different monitoring operations around the province to enhance knowledge sharing and reduce duplication of efforts. So this is something that we've talked a bit about today already. There's a lot of great work being done in terms of citizen science. So how can that really be supported and streamlined? And yeah, so that's it. I've come in just under 30 minutes, and I'm happy to take a couple questions if you have them. The report is much longer than my presentation, but it is available on our website if you're looking at more information.